Welcome to the Science and Beers podcast with me, Michael Magee. Talking science and drinking beers with researchers down at the pub. So join us with a brew and let's cheers to science. Today I'm going to be tapping into the brain of Aglae Pizzone. She is an expert in Byzantine literature. So we're going to be going on a journey into the past over the next hour or so to explore the uses of literature and the enjoyment of literature during the Byzantine Empire. I'm going to be talking to her about fake news, rap battles in the old empire, and towards the end we're going to be focusing on the use of emotions, how emotions were depicted in literature back then, so that we can ask the question, did people then think like we do today? I hope you crack open a beer and enjoy this chat with myself and Aglae. The bars are still closed here in Denmark, so it was a virtual beer that we had together. So please help us by sharing this podcast, recommend it to a friend, give it a like, give it a share, give it a review on whatever app you're using to listen to the podcast. I'm your host, Michael Magee. My guest is Aglae Pizzone from the Danish Institute for Advanced Study. Cheers to science. Aglae Pizzone, you are an assistant professor at the Department of History at the University of Southern Denmark in the Centre for Medieval Literature. You're also a fellow at the Danish Institute of Advanced Studies. Your research interests are the history of emotions and the emergence of a secular, non-confessional self in Byzantium.
Yes.
So today we're going to talk about uses of literature in Byzantium with particular focus on emotions.
Yes.
But before we do that, we're going to have to crack open a beer and have a cheers.
Oh,
I think. Oh, I've got a can here.
No, I got a bottle, Edinburgh beer.
An Edinburgh beer. Nice.
Yeah. It is Innocent Gun.
Innocent Gun. What is it?
Yeah.
A lager or an IPA?
It's a barrel-aged Scotch ale. Bourbon barrel
a
Scotch
ale. It tastes like whiskey. Okay. You're serious today then?
Yeah, I mean, I needed it for today. So.
Well, I'm on a Danish beer by the company Tutul. It's called World Domination, and it's an Indian.
It's really modest and understated. Really.
World Domination, yeah. It's just 6.2%. So, yep, it's a good start.
I'm not sure how much is that, but I'll try it.
It must be strong if there's whiskey in it.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Skål.
That's good.
I should have said saluti. You're from Italy?
Yeah, salute. Yeah.
Salute. Okay. Okay. So let's paint a picture first, Aglae.
Yeah.
Byzantium. When was the Empire of Byzantium?
Yeah, I mean, the history of the Byzantine Empire is a very long history. And it spans across 1 millennium, basically, from the late 4th century until the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when the city and the empire, therefore, were captured and conquered by the Ottomans. First of all, I mean, I think that we should say that we used to say Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines, but actually, I mean, this is not really the way they talked about themselves, because they conceptualized themselves as the heirs of the Roman Empire. So they would say about themselves, we are the Romans.
So they identified themselves as Romans, and it was a continuation of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Where did the name Byzantium come from?
Byzantium was the name of the Greek settlement of the city, I mean, of the site where the city of Constantinople was built by Constantine the Great. And that's why, I mean, in modern scholarship also we talk about Byzantium and Byzantine Empire.
whenever I think of the Roman Empire, I'm picturing emperors in white robes, and I'm picturing gladiator games, and I'm picturing goblets of wine. And whenever I picture Byzantium, I'm picturing more of these mosaic iconographies and monks, and much more of a religious theme.
I mean, religion was very important and was an essential part also in all the rituals, only the secular rituals, political rituals. So that was very important. But it was also, I mean, we get this static picture, through the mosaics. But in reality, I mean, even though, I mean, the ceremonial was quite painstaking in a way and quite rigid, there was also very lively culture. So, I mean, these ceremonies were often accompanied by very, as I said, lively spectacles. For instance, I mean, in the Hippodrome was this place where chariot races took place. And that was a very important moment in the city life of Constantinople. And it was both a sport event, but also a political event, because there were these circus factions. So the Hippodrome could contain up to 40,000 people. So it's huge. And it was as wide as to contain 4 chariots. So there were these races with 4 chariots, and each chariot was accompanied by a color. And there were supporters for each color. So there were the white, the red, the blue, and the greens. And those supporters were really vocal and could be used also for political purposes. Like football clubs.
I'm thinking football clubs. Yeah,
we still have that in Italy. I mean, it's there are power groups sometimes still, and that was really strong in Byzantium, especially in the first period. I mean, of the empire.
Well, that is interesting, because we're talking about at the peak of the empire a huge expanse of land. You're talking about modern day Greece, Turkey, Syria, North Africa.
Yeah, Iberian Peninsula as well. At the moment of the greatest expansion, really, because then, I mean, it was really variable. I mean, the territorial extension of the empire was hardly stable.
So you mentioned religion was important back then, but in an area so big, I imagine there was a few different religions present. The question is, did racism or sectarianism exist in the kingdom as it does today?
I think that we have to differentiate between the issue of race and the issue of sectarianism. The latter could more easily emerge in terms of different approaches to the Christian doctrine. So, I mean, schisms and, different interpretations of Christian theology, where just think about this huge period of time characterized by the so-called iconoclasm. So there was a moment in which holy icons, holy images of Christ, of the Virgin, were forbidden. And that really polarized the political scene and also spiritual scene in Constantinople for a very long time, a couple of centuries at least. Racism, there is, I mean, it's a hot issue, of course, as concerns all the pre-modern world. But there is a very recent book, a very good book by Roland Bettencourt called Byzantine Intersectionality, where he explores precisely the issue of racism. And he shows through some texts that there was no such thing as we conceptualize it. And this is true for most of the pre-modern world, because there was no biological idea of race. That's a modern invention from the late 19th, early 20th century. it's true that some fixed features might be ascribed to ethnicity, but it was more a cultural thing. So skin color didn't matter, really. And as you said, I mean, there was a huge territorial extension, and some of these territories would switch from one year to the other, for instance, from being Christian to being Muslims. And these brought about a notion of boundaries, which was much more porous and flexible than we would imagine. And if you think, I mean, in the 12th century, there is an estimate that in Constantinople there were 400,000 people, and among them, 60 to 80,000 were foreigners. So it was a very cosmopolitan society. And there were also neighborhood quarters that were just, assigned to foreigners. There was a Venetian quarter, there was also the Jewish quarter, and also the Saracen. Some sources also mentioned these Saracen quarters where probably, they had also common meals and, social gathering, at least, judging from the words used to describe these areas. And so these big cities were really, a crossroad of people and cultures.
What I'm thinking about here is just how fluid it was, like religion was then, and also the diversity of where people were from. So that kept changing, but the one thing that was consistent was the empire, the identity of being Roman, which is very interesting. It's like that was a much more stronger self-identity than religion or which country you were from.
Yeah, and if you think about it, this diversity was already inherent to the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was tolerant by definition. Once, the problem is that the Christians wouldn't recognize imperial authority, but there was a fairly good tolerance toward also different religious forms. So the problem is always when the political authority was put in question.
I want to know a little bit about the structure of society, because I want to know which kind of people had access to literature, which kind of people could read and write. So if you could tell me a little bit about the structure of society.
Of course, these changes in the story of the empire in the centuries that I know better, which are the 11th and the 12th century, and perhaps this is also a reason why I like those centuries. We see social movements. We see new raising classes that get to power through culture. So having a good education all of a sudden becomes a way to ensure a good position within the administration of the empire. And this brings, of course, social change. So we have a new class of administrators that emerges quite clearly from our sources, and also, new money. This is quite clear in the 12th century. So this also brings about a broadening of literacy. So reading and writing become more common. And these, we see also provincial families, for instance, going to the capital and getting closer to the imperial circles, really. And that's why, I really like this period, because we see this movement, this ferment, this change, and this possibility also of making a career through education. And that was possible also for people coming from, this disadvantaged background to a certain extent, because one of the, of the enterprise of this dynasty ruling in the 12th century was precisely to relaunch an institution called the orphanage. it's quite self-explanatory, which was designed to allow also young people in need to get an education. And what's really interesting is that often also war prisoners, for instance, I mean, from Muslim war prisoners, were, educated at the orphanage and became integral to the Constantinopolitan society.
Well, it's very interesting to hear 1,000 years ago, a large empire like that had a social welfare system and it had a structure in place that if you had an education, you could make it. Your fate wasn't totally dictated at birth as it was in some other cultures at that time. One more question before we move on to the next section. Were they drinking beer in Byzantine?
I mean, I kind of expected this question, so I think I remember they did. Yeah. But I don't have any detail about the trade and how it worked.
They were definitely into the wine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in all these banquets, for instance, I mean, the one have described for the Epiphany, they drank and they ate a lot, really. It was a large gathering of people eating and drinking and listening to speeches. So this was, like an occasion in which culture was performed because they would eat, drink, and listen.
And so these performances was it theater? Were they reading some kind of text? Was literature involved in the performances?
Yes, I mean the theater aspect is very interesting, and it's been debated for a very long time because very often these gatherings are called in the sources theater. Mm-hmm. So this is the term they use. And so, of course, I mean, discussions, there have been discussions among scholars what they meant by theater. And the consensus is that, I mean, they meant this kind of, oral performance, which very often took the shape of a duel of words, if you want. So there were different people involved performing.
Like a battle rap?
If you want, yes. And we know, I mean, from indications in the manuscripts that preserved some of these texts, that some of them were produced impromptu. So people were asked, please sing me something about that.
Wow.
And you had to be able to stand up and perform. So what you said, I mean, that it's good that culture could be used to make a career for oneself is true, but it was also a risky business, because if one of those performances went bad, your career was over. So it was that's why it was so important to be trained properly in rhetoric.
And so how did they train in rhetoric?
There were schools. I mean, especially at the level that we would call higher education. There were schools belonging to the network of the Patriarchate. So the great church was, I mean, the main church in Constantinople, and it was linked to the Patriarchate. And then there were probably other schools in other church outposts. Each school had its own teachers assigned. And so there was also a job industry in a way behind these positions, which were very coveted by intellectuals. And there were also kind of, wars between schools, and we can see that in different approaches to rhetoric. And there were handbooks that would train the people to know the theory and practice also rhetoric for these purposes of performance.
What are these books that you mentioned that they learnt from?
So, I mean, these books, there is a handbook which is called Homogenean Corpus from Hermogenes, who was an author who lived in between the 2nd and 3rd century CE. So belonging to the Greco-Roman period. And that became the standard handbook. But of course, I mean, as I said, it had been produced much earlier. And so we have, especially in this period, 11th, 12th century, and these are the texts I study, there are commentaries that are produced, which are designed to update these handbooks, basically. Yeah. So, and to speak to contemporary audiences.
A handbook from hundreds of years before?
Yeah. They were used still as handbooks, but of course they needed some sort of update, and the update took the shape of these commentaries, which are preserved in an self-standing form sometimes, like manuscripts, or written in the margins of earlier copies of these handbooks. And these are interesting because they show different approaches to the matter, which often reflect different trends in these schools I've mentioned.
Would you compare it to like a modern day version or an old version of modern day TED?
I think that those performances could be thought about in those terms. I think that sometimes, I mean, more improvisation was required than a standard TED Talk, which had a lot of rehearsal. So it was a riskier business, I think, for a Byzantine speaker, for a young person asked to perform in such theaters, because they really were there with their body and with their memory. And they didn't have all the tools also to record that we have today. So it was really all stored in their mind. And you have also to imagine that when they were performing, it's not just what they made up through their ability to speak, but also all the quotations from ancient works they could insert just from memory.
Wow.
So all these references, and it was all there, all in their brain.
Okay, you had to be fairly clever to make it in that world. So that's the oral world. What about literature? How did the Byzantines enjoy literature?
I mean, I see oral performances also as literature.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't see such, clear-cut divide between the written and the oral world when it comes especially to rhetoric and to this kind of, production. It's true that very often, I mean, when they got to be published, these speeches were revised. And when we know that because very often, I mean, they are too long for a performance, so they are expanded probably for the written version. And in terms of consumption of literature, we have, I mean, from some texts, I mean, we get the feeling that they would, as we do, for instance, read in bed.
Yeah.
And fall asleep while reading, for instance. There are people who describe that.
Well, were they reading novels, as we would know?
That's interesting because in the period I studied, there was a revival of the novel. In Greco-Roman times, starting probably around, the beginning of the Christian era, all of a sudden, I mean, we have a new genre emerging, which is the genre of the novel. And it's fairly standard, at least for the text that we have. Those are stories of boy meets girl, boy and girl fall in love.
Classic story arc of drama and fall and suspense.
And they are separated and they go through a series of mishaps, false death, pirates, attempts of rape, all these, sort of features of adventure stories. And probably it was a very popular genre because we have texts that are not so refined in terms of style, but are really just punchy in terms of a willingness of being gripping and also full of graphic details. So they really it's a traditional feature, of this kind of adventure novels that even now we have.
Would we be able to say that Homer's Odyssey was a novel?
Oh, that's a really clever remark, because in fact, that's the prototype of the travelogue, of a story based on travel. And very often we see, especially in the more refined novels, stories from the Greco-Roman period, we see that authors tend to follow or to allude to the blueprint of the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
So the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
And it was surely a reference they had in mind, and an influence also on the way they structured their stories. So what's interesting is that these novels was read throughout all the Byzantine millennium, and we have sources that testify to that, but no new texts were produced. We don't know really why. One of the reasons might be that with the emergence of a new genre called hagiography, so the life of saints,
mm-hmm.
This demand for, adventurous stories was partially met through this other textual typology.
Okay, so the market was asking for stories about the saints, adventure stories about the saints specifically.
I think there's a concise way to put it, but yes. And what's interesting is that in the 12th century, all of a sudden, we see a new production of these novels. So out of the blue, we have a series of texts that really remind us of the novels from the Greco-Roman period, with the same, let's say, secular content of boy meets girl and boy fall in love.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know why. They started again writing this kind of text. That's a big question mark, actually.
Like a novel today, and novels back then, whenever you have a made-up character, you're able to put yourself into their mind, into their frame of reference.
Yeah.
Are there any not autobiographical pieces of literature back then where the person describes themselves, and then therefore we can put ourselves in the mind of an actual person from Byzantine?
Yeah. So first of all, putting oneself in someone else's shoes was an exercise that they had to do in these rhetorical schools. And these exercises were called progymnasmata, so preparatory exercises. Mm-hmm. And the teacher would ask a pupil, imagine to be Achilles, taken by grief because of the loss of Patroclus, Achilles' friend and perhaps lover. What would you say? And they had to impersonate, Achilles. So the idea of impersonation, of impersonating someone else's feeling, was really central to this kind of literary culture. But we also have autobiographical accounts, and they become more frequent in these centuries I'm interested in. In particular, I work on an author that takes every opportunity he has to talk about himself, even when, you wouldn't expect that. He, finds room for his own personal rants and, complaints and memories about his life. So it's to the extent that sometimes, I get the feeling that if I started writing a biography, I could go year by year by piecing everything together.
Yeah. Well, what's the name of this person?
He has a funny name. In English, it's John Setsis.
Okay. But I guess
It's
his actual
okay.
name isn't pronounced like that. I'm going to crack open another beer here. Oh, there.
Yeah.
I got a bit fizzy there. Cheers. Skål.
Yes.
Mm-mm-mm. So you have with this guy John, you have a
Yeah.
real insight into the workings of his mind, because he was a prolific writer about himself.
Yeah, I think he was also a bit obsessive, probably. I mean, but don't quote me on that. I mean, this is my just, like, how you say, non-professional impression
Yeah.
I have about him. But yes, I mean, and it's not just that, because I was, lucky enough to find a manuscript, which is preserved in Leiden University Library, where it's one of these commentaries on a homogeneous rhetorical handbook I've mentioned before. And it's a copy that has been edited by himself. So, I mean, we have a huge amount of marginal notes in the manuscript in his own hand. So that gives us access really to his workshop, and it's as if we could see him work before our very eyes, because we can see what changed. I mean, we can see also the issues he had with copies, and he talks about himself. He says how old he was. He complains because even if he's 70, still he has to correct proofs, basically, and, losing his eyesight while doing it. And so it's really a first-hand account in every sense of the term.
Okay, so it's a nice portal into his thinking, and he sounds like quite an eccentric character.
Yeah, totally eccentric, yeah. And he had a lot of quarrels with, all sorts of people moving in these elite circles of the capital. He had issues against, contemporary education. So, but that's useful for us as historians, because we can see a lot of behind the scenes.
So did authors, like autobiographical authors such as John, did they have how did they present themselves? Did other people besides John have an agenda?
Yeah, that's I mean, they all had an agenda, but usually, I mean, for instance, one of the places we often find autobiographical statements are prefaces. So in the prefaces, usually, I mean, they explain why they put together this work, why they deemed it worth of being published. And there was a sort of etiquette, if you want, when one wrote these pieces. And this etiquette requested that one didn't have to put himself really center stage too much. So there was an ethics of humility, if you want, very often.
So you couldn't brag about yourself. You couldn't say,
I mean, you couldn't say, I mean, I'm writing that because I'm the best on the market, and with this book, you'll get something unique you won't get in other books. I mean, you couldn't do that. I mean, it wasn't deemed proper.
It's not proper. Like Denmark. Denmark is different, a different culture from where I'm from and you're from. In Denmark, there's a thing called jantelov, where you're no better than your neighbor, which is actually, I think it's quite a healthy thing. But a lot of people, there's been a lot of commentary on jantelov, but it's basically you're no better than your neighbor, and don't do anything to stick out from the crowd, which is why if you walk along the streets of Odense or Copenhagen, people are generally dressed in similar colored clothing.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, it's quite
sorry
comparable.
For the Danes listening for that stereotype there, but that's there's some evidence to suggest it's true.
But it's quite comparable. For instance, I mean, one of the tropes, so one of the ways that these issue was addressed was to say, okay, I'm writing that, but I couldn't help because everyone asked me for that. All my friends pushed me to write and to publish this thing, and I'm doing that only for their sake and not just, for my desire of glory or, fame. And so this was, for instance, a very common way to, get around this etiquette issue. And we don't see that with my John.
I was just about to say, John doesn't sound like a character that's kept to the rule of being humble.
We don't see that.
The sound of his own voice.
No. He plays a version of the humility game in that he says that he didn't want to take part in this, world of official teachers I mentioned before. And so he chose a more private life on his own will. So this is his version of, the humility card. But in fact, he says that he chose that because he despised those other people. So.
Wow, he sounds like he's on some kind of spectrum, or John. How do you feel reading, if you have access to the, say, original text that somebody wrote 1,000 years ago about themselves? How do you feel looking at that?
That was when I realized that, because I didn't realize it straight when I had this text in front of me. But when I realized that I felt like that was the highlight of my career, really. And also, I felt as if I was sitting next to him.
Wow.
It was so bizarre, really, as if he was speaking to me. And imagine, it was, I think, in November, Danish November, very late in the afternoon. I was in my office and I was kind of trying to understand what he was saying in one of these notes in which he says, okay, I'm old, I'm 70. And when I understood that, I thought, oh my God, that's unbelievable, because I already had the suspicion it was him. But when I read that, I almost felt like, okay, he came to me to assure me that, okay, it's really me,
I'm imagining archaeologists, you can find things that people used in the past, and that's fascinating enough, but to have the written word, you're really getting a feel for their emotions and how they were thinking.
Yeah, you can totally see his emotions in his handwriting, because sometimes he gets so angry with the copies, for instance, that he punctures the paper.
Wow, just stabs it with his whatever he's using to write.
He's so pissed off. So really, you can see the emotions from the handwriting, and that's another amazing thing I find.
Wow. So about emotions then, because you're a historian of emotions.
Oh, I try to be at least.
Yeah. So, they spoke a different language than we're speaking now in Byzantine. Our use of words to describe emotions today, like anger, happiness, sadness, did they have this similar uses back then, or did they have a different way of using words to describe their emotions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that it's really hard to answer. Even in nowadays, because it's, for instance, in cross-linguistic research about emotions, one of the big questions is, how do we understand whether two words belonging to two different languages mean the same emotion? So the fact is that very often, we have an emotion word, let's call that an emotion word. And this emotion word more or less describes the same kind of psychobiological reaction, right? But the value we associate to that reaction very often changes according to the cultural environment, the time we are in. For instance, in the case of dejection, I mean, in the first text, we find the term, and the first text, when I say first text, I mean as early as Homer, right? Dejection is the sadness that comes from missing a target. So you throw your spear, you miss your target, you are like, really, you lower your gaze and you have this feeling of sadness. And it's, of course, a very negative emotion. So when we have the transition to the Christian period, the same kind of awareness of failure becomes somewhat positive because it becomes an enticement to better oneself, to acknowledge the sinful nature of man or woman, and to improve oneself through devotion. And that's why, I mean, we have dejection describing the same kind of psychobiological reaction, but the value ascribed to it becomes positive. So when we work with emotion words, there are many dimensions that have to be taken into account. So the descriptive dimension, which pertains to this, like psychobiological area, which is there, but also, I mean, the value dimension and the moral dimension, which can change more easily. Anger, for instance, I mean, he's characterized, and that's caused culture by increased heartbeat, a feeling of hotness, becoming red, and all these features, I mean, are really transcultural. But then, I mean, the way you make sense of it might change a lot according to the period, according to the language, according to the place you live in.
So the actual what you feel with these emotions are the same, but how you then how you deal with it, or is it changes depending on the circumstances, the culture that you're living in?
Yeah, the emotion is a combination of feeling is already, like a very subjective term. Feeling is already, implies your own perception, implies your own appraisal of what's going on in your nervous system. So the emotion is like this feedback loop, which consists of the psychobiological aspect, so what happens in the body and in the nervous system, and the way we appraise that. And in the way we appraise that, there are other dimensions, such as arousal, value, moral, cultural. So, and all these together, and this feedback that is ongoing, represents the emotional event. So at least this is the framework I subscribe to, because I think that it works very well also with the cultural aspects and with literary representations of emotions.
Well, that's it. If you this could be a complicated question, but today, especially on social media and even in the media, in the news, a lot of the things that we click on are things that appeal to our core emotions, things that make us angry or make us happy. And indeed, that's where a lot of fake news comes from. So lies and deceit that, say, politicians tell or just media tell just to get you to click, so that they can sell products to you that you don't need. And even those products, the advertisements, the marketing for these products, they appeal to our emotions. For example, you can look at an advertisement for soap that says soap is going to clean you. It's trying to say, okay, buy this soap and you'll be like this beautiful, beautiful person that's currently using the soap. So what I'm getting at here is emotions are used today to manipulate people. Was there
as they always have been?
Okay. So was there a literature political use of emotions?
Yeah. I mean, that was quite common. Political also in a very broad sense. I'm thinking, for instance, I mean, we have this historian, in the 6th century called Procopius, who wrote two histories, an official one and a secret history.
Okay.
And in the secret history, he portrays Justinian and his wife Theodora as, the most debased persons, and he clearly has the goal of arousing disgust and hatred in his readers. And that was quite, it was like a pamphlet, against.
It's slanderous.
Yeah. And that was, all based on the emotions that these really graphic tales could elicit in the reader. And also in other fields, I'm thinking, for instance, of the usage of fear. Mm-hmm. Fear, and not just fear, for the outer groups, but also in-group fear. So fear for toward the sin, that's particularly strong in homilies, for instance, to keep together monastic communities. Mm-hmm. The leaders would appeal to fear. They would really try through their homilies to arouse fear.
Fear to commit sin.
Yeah. So it's not fear of the stranger, but fear of what you might do as an individual.
Invoke fear for stories of what's going to happen to you in the afterlife.
Yeah. And that was a way to forge community bonds, to create a glue for the community.
Okay. So
admittedly, a very gloomy one.
Yeah.
But how it worked often.
So the portrayal of emotions in literature. So today we have a lot of different words, like if I'm thinking about something positive, like excellent, brilliant, awesome, fantastic, marvelous, great. We have a lot of things to describe something that's fairly similar. So, and I imagine they must have came from somewhere. And I was thinking about this, and if you look at art, from cave paintings to Van Gogh, I could see it as an increase in complexity from 2-dimensional paintings to 3-dimensional paintings, where the expression of emotions was much more complex. Is this true? Am I just imagining this, or has literature also increased has literature tools evolved in such a way that we are able to describe emotions much more articulately today?
Yeah, I think that the comparison perhaps holds only up to a certain point.
Yeah.
Because, when we deal with literature, we deal with words and language. Mm-hmm. And language is something that we are born with. That it's part of our humanity, mm-hmm. right? Whereas, we are not born with the skills of painting. Mm-hmm. So it's not, part really of our nature as human beings. And this a basic difference if between words and images, I feel. Mm-hmm. Even though I'm sure that not everyone would agree on that, but this is how I feel. And when it comes to pictures, there are also technical skills to develop that probably are more objectively measurable, if you want. Just think about, the perspective. So, and the technical advances we have also in technical design and stuff. I think that probably since the beginning, there is more complexity in literary works. So, and I think that there probably if they don't look as complex as modern works to us, I think that's because we cannot see through the scripts that they are made of for literary works. Because I wouldn't say, for instance, that Homer is less complex than a modern work. I wouldn't say that. And it really captures also the complexity of our emotional reactions. But we have to be able to see through it. So that the effort as historians of literature that we have to do.
Yeah.
An example, this really a basic example I always think about is silent movies.
Yeah.
Silent movies, if we watch them now, they look really almost ridiculous to us. But I'm sure that for the viewer back then, they could relate to the bodily expression of emotions. And probably, I'm also sure that this way of, storing the emotions and representing the emotions had an impact in turn on the viewer. Then when, the viewers were experiencing something similar, they would, have in mind the way, these silent actors moved.
That's a very good analogy. I remember watching an interview with people who were describing their first experience in cinema with black and white or silent films, and they were blown away. Their minds were blown. They were so into it. They were really emotionally moved, scared and excited and all the probably to a much greater extent than we would be today if we went to a cinema and saw all of the computer graphics and whatnot.
Yeah, because I think that we would find the scripts artificial. That's the point, because we cannot see them through the same eyes that they were seen by the first viewers. So, and that's the great task we have, to recover something of those eyes. Even
that's what I want to get at. I want, were people in 1100 years ago, were they thinking like us? If we met John today, we would probably think he was a bit crazy, but
I don't think that he would have liked to have anything to do with me, because he was also a very misogynist guy.
You can find guys like that today. In researching for this podcast, Aglae, I stumbled upon something that I want to get at as well, because I found it fascinating. There was a prime minister of England in the late 1800s called William Gladstone, and he was obsessed with Homer, and he wrote about it, and he made the observation that the colour blue was never mentioned, and so this inspired other scholars to go back into ancient text, the Iliad or the Bible, and notice that the colour blue was never mentioned, and so they could see around the world, except for the Egyptians, they could see around the world that in literature they first started to describe black and white, and then they started to describe red, and then green, and finally blue entered the literature. I'm talking chronologically. And the theory is that it's because they couldn't make these colors. They could make red, they could make green, and then it like blue only came along whenever they discovered the rare earth mineral lapis lazuli. And then blue entered the spectrum of clothing, dye, and paint. It was so interesting to hear that they didn't have a word to describe blue, and then it draws the question: if you lack the word for something, are you able to see it? Are you able to see it the same way you can if you have the word?
This is a very thorny issue, and one that's hard to resolve once for all. It's true that probably we have a notion of colors based on spectrography. So on the spectrum, whereas the first way, the original way to label colors was object based. So you would name colors based on the objects that they represented them, right? But again, I mean, this is not really an area of expertise I have, and I don't think that they saw the world differently.
Well, I know it's not your area, but I just found it fascinating. The whole opened up a little bit more, and today there's a tribe in Namibia called the Himba, and they don't have a word for blue. They don't have any pigment to make blue, but they have dozens of words to describe shades of green. And so they made an experiment where they had a circle of 12 different greens and one blue, and asked the people to identify which one was blue, and they couldn't get the blue. But then they changed one of the shades of green and asked people from different cultures to point out where the different shade of green was, and they couldn't see it. But the Himba were able to straight away point out the different shade of green. So the theory would be it's because they have the word for it. So the brain processes observations whenever the brain can put words on it and describe it.
I think, I mean, a bit like with emotions, there is this feedback loop. For instance, I mean, I've mentioned that we have these, psychobiological features of anger, no? Right, feeling hot and these reactions, I mean, and that are based in our nervous system, has given life to certain metaphors, no? To express emotions, and those are grounded in the way we feel. But then, I mean, these metaphors in turn start shaping the way we think and the way we conceptualize emotions. And so the language in this respect has an impact on the way we see the world. I think that
my ears are steaming. There's steam coming out of my ears to describe anger. And if you see something with steam coming out of their ears, you're like, okay, I know what that means.
I mean, a variant, I would say, of the container metaphor. Very often, I mean, these kind of emotions are described as a liquid that cannot be contained. And that's a cross-cultural metaphor, really, for overwhelming emotions such as anger. And of course, I mean, but this, which is grounded in the way we feel, then starts shaping also the way we think and the way we see the world.
But it is so fascinating that uses of language and literature can really shape how we see the world and how we think.
I think that's totally true, and that's why, I mean, words might be dangerous as well. So.
Yes, I love it. Just before we end, I want to ask you, how did you get into this field? How did you become a Byzantist?
Byzantinist.
Oh, sorry.
I became. I mean, when I was in high school, I was fascinated with the Middle Ages, really. Maybe because, I mean, when I was younger, I mean, it was the heyday of this new approach to medieval history that really looked at a social history, a micro history as well. So, I mean, it looked really at everyday life of people in the Middle Ages, and I found it very fascinating.
To try to put yourself in their shoes?
Yeah, I like that. I like that we could really see and almost touch with what they were doing, and their ideology. But then, I mean, I was led astray, and I started doing classics at university. And so, I mean, by a series of chance encounters and fortuitous circumstances, I went back to the Middle Ages through Byzantium. So if I think about my trajectory now, I mean, I feel that, in the end, I mean, I came back home to what really I was passionate about in my teenage years. So,
if you had a time machine, where would you go?
That's my God. I've thought about that very often. I think that, I mean, by now I would choose 12th century Constantinople.
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to see it really, and to see all the things we cannot see anymore because we have lost all this documentation.
Yeah. I'll bet, but that would certainly be fun. So, mentioned at the start, you're part of the Danish Institute for Advanced Study, and
Yeah.
and this season of the podcast, I have a different guest from this network, and the whole idea of this network is to bring people from different areas of expertise.
Yeah.
Have you found it useful to interact with people that are coming from completely different fields of study?
Totally. I mean, totally. It's for me. It's really important also because different approaches, I mean, are really helpful in a broad way to address what you study. I mean, what I'm studying from a different perspective, and to see things differently, and maybe to find also new questions to ask. And also, I mean, this just, I mean, like very recent, I recently got interested in the relationship between rhetoric and science, so to understand the rhetoric of science. And so now I really look forward to establishing some more concrete cooperation in this respect with people working in mathematics, for instance, and physics. I mean, mathematics and physics, and also in theories of learning, because I want to see, I mean, how, I mean, the texts I study can tie in with also modern approaches, and and to try this multidisciplinary approach to the text.
Great to hear. Great to hear that people from different fields are interacting, because ideas come from diversity.
Yeah, and I really believe in that. And I'm always very excited to like go out of my comfort zone and learn a new knowledge. So.
Well, Aglae, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Absolutely fascinating to have an insight into life in 12th century Constantinople. Cheers.
Cheers, and thank you.
Really nice talking to you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed that trip to Byzantium. If you want to follow up and do some more research, I will link to some of Aglae's work in the description of this podcast. Also, please consider supporting this podcast. You can do that in a variety of ways. You can recommend the podcast, tell a friend about the podcast, leave us a review on whatever app or website you're using to listen to the podcast. And tune in next time. I have been your host, Michael Magee. Cheers to science.